William and Matilda, they've really now become quite a power couple. And Normandy is well and truly on the rise. So much so that during the late 1050s, William sets his sights not just on the immediate borders of Normandy, but on England itself. So according to the Bayeux Tapestry and according to other Norman sources, it's during this time that Edward the Confessor, King of England, names William his heir, as early as 1051, according to one source. Now, I've always thought this quite unlikely. Why would he name the Duke of Normandy as his heir when there were plenty of homegrown Saxon candidates? Well, it's not beyond the realms of possibility because Edward the Confessor had spent a lot of time in Normandy. He felt close links to the duchy. But I can't help thinking there's quite a lot of sort of retrospective justification for the Norman Conquest. And this is part of it, you know, in this depiction of Edward giving his blessing. Well, William's main rival for the English throne was Harold Godwinson, a powerful Saxon lord with kinship to Edward the Confessor. But in 1064, fate played into William's hands when Harold was shipwrecked off the coast of Normandy. Why he was anywhere near the coast of Normandy in 1064 is a mystery that still confuses historians. It's said that he was on a fishing expedition that got blown off course, quite a long way off course from the Sussex coast over to Normandy. But of course, William made the most of the sudden arrival of Harold on Norman soil, and he invited him as an honoured guest to the Norman court. It was very soon obvious that poor Harold was not a guest. He was effectively a prisoner. And he wasn't going to be allowed to return to England until he'd relinquished his claim to the English throne in favour of William's. And again, we have this scene depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry with Harold swearing on holy relics to recognise William there on the left as the future King of England. I should have said Edward the Confessor has no children and no prospect of any children. So this is all according to Norman sources, which are very much contradicted by Saxon sources at the time. And we perhaps will never know for sure whether Harold really did swear to give up his claim in favour of William's. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor died and Harold Godwinson on the right, he claimed the throne very, very quickly. Well, when William heard of this, he was furious that Harold had apparently gone back on his promise, and William immediately began planning to invade. So William prepares to invade, and Matilda is behind his war efforts every step of the way. She commissions this magnificent flagship, the Mora, for her husband to sail across the Channel to England. And by the way, to honour the 1000th anniversary of William's birth in 2027, there are plans in Normandy to build a replica of the Mora. I would say if you're into Norman history, go over to Normandy in 2027 because there's a lot going on. I would also just say that we don't know for sure that William was born in 1027. It might have been 1028, but let's go with that anniversary. And it's certainly going to be an awful lot going on of interest in Normandy. So William eventually set sail in late September 1066, having waited for favourable winds to convey him and his huge fleet across the Channel. And the first thing that happens to him looks disastrous because he lands at the beach at Pevensey. And the very first thing to happen is that William stumbles and falls flat on his face on the beach. So, of course, in this age where everybody believes in evil omens and signs, this doesn't look good. As William's men look on and their leader has fallen on English soil, or sand, technically. And so there's this sort of horror-struck silence. And then one of William's quick-thinking knights says, "See, He has England in his hands already, because of course William has a handful of sand. So few managed to rescue that one, and William recovers himself and marches towards Hastings, where on the 14th of October he goes into battle with Harold's forces, who of course have made that huge march south from Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. It's said that Harold's forces are tired, that's why William had the advantage. But I think recent research contests that. They were actually pretty well rested by the time they fought the Normans at the Battle of Hastings. It was a very, very finely balanced battle. Now, I used to work at English Heritage, and I was responsible for the reenactments that we did, and the annual reenactment of the Battle of Hastings, which I think still takes place at Battle Abbey. And it was always the longest reenactment staged because neither side wanted to give in. And it's amazing how many of the crowds each year would cheer for the Saxons and then be really disappointed when the Normans won again. It's like, that's always going to happen. And of course, that is what happened at the Battle of Hastings. William and his forces were triumphant. Almost certainly, Harold wasn't, as the tapestry suggests, killed with an arrow in the eye. It's likely he was hacked to death, but certainly this battle would be decisive. I would like to say, though, that even though it's become the most famous battle and probably still the most famous date in English history, the Battle of Hastings, 1066, we all know it, it wasn't the end for William. It was just the beginning of his campaign to conquer England. He had years of bitter fighting ahead before he'd finally brought the Saxons to heel. He was crowned Christmas Day, 1066. In Westminster Abbey, and it was one of the most calamitous coronations ever in English royal history because it was a very tense affair. Nobody wanted this Norman king. So he'd had guards stationed outside the abbey in case of trouble. And then at the part of the ceremony where people are asked to cheer for their new king, the guards heard this kind of cheer go up and they mistook it for some kind of riot in the abbey. So they started kind of going on the rampage and torching houses and attacking Saxons, and the whole thing fell into disarray, and William was left pretty much alone to almost have just one bishop crown him. Everybody else had scarpered from the abbey because they were so terrified. It was not a good beginning, I think it's fair to say, to his rule in England. Well, William quickly made his way to London straight after the Battle of Hastings because, as I said, the Battle of Hastings was just the beginning, and it was crucial that William secure London. It was the key to the kingdom. It hadn't always been. During Anglo-Saxon times, when England was divided into 7 separate kingdoms, Wessex and Winchester really was where the centre of power lay. But now it was London, and William immediately set about building a great tower, as this place was first called. And it was quite a canny move because he actually made use of some of the Roman wall, London Wall, which was still very much standing and in good order. So he sort of built around part of the London Wall, as you see. And you can see, hopefully, that central keep just emerging in the middle there, just towards the top. And William was absolutely determined to build this huge keep to really act as a symbol of Norman domination. And this was the Normans' tactic. They built castles with bewildering speed. And it was almost like flat pack castles. They brought over these wooden keeps from Normandy and put them up very, very quickly. And they were for defence, but as well, I would say they were for PR. This sending out this message, the Normans are here to stay. So suddenly England is littered with these huge Norman keeps. The biggest of all, which eventually became this stone keep built during the 1070s, is what you're going to become very familiar with today. The White Tower, as it's called today, but as I said, it was known as the Great Tower in William's day, and it only became known as the White Tower when King Henry III ordered it to be whitened to be whitewashed on its exterior so that it was more visible, and then it became known as the White Tower. Well, William, there's a lovely quote that he wished to build a tower in London in order to subdue the capital's evil inhabitants. He didn't think much to London. So he has his work cut out now as King of England and also Duke of Normandy. But he has assistants. And he makes sure that in his new Tower of London, he has luxurious royal accommodation built. It's not just a fortress, it's a power base for William and his family. And it includes this absolutely exquisite Romanesque chapel, the chapel of St. John the Evangelist, which you'll have chance to see. And there was also very, very lavish accommodation for William and his family. Meanwhile, back in Normandy, Matilda was at prayer at the priory of Notre Dame du Pré, which means Our Lady of Good News, because she renamed it that when she heard the good news that her husband had succeeded in conquering England and was now king, which meant that she was now Queen of England. And Matilda's role becomes very, very prominent now because she switches from being regent of Normandy to then regent in England, so that they're constantly on the move, her and William almost playing tag team, really, as they try to keep this vast Anglo-Norman dynasty together. Matilda makes her way over to England in 1068, and she is crowned in a much more successful, smooth-running coronation in 1068 around Easter. So it was all it was timed for the most holy part of the year. And what was really significant about Matilda's coronation is that she was recognised as queen in her own right. She was actually formally recognised as queen. Up until that point, there had been other women who'd gone through a coronation, but they were always just called the wife of the king. Matilda was styled queen, and that was hugely important. But it also courted a great deal of suspicion and hostility amongst the Saxon people who called Matilda the strange woman. And they didn't like the fact that here was this very, very powerful woman, and already her husband was deeply unpopular. So it was a slightly shaky start, but Matilda was much better at what we would call PR than her husband. She really went to town on all of her public royal appearances. And one of her masterstrokes was that when she arrived in 1068, she was quite heavily pregnant. Don't worry, William had gone back to Normandy, so there was nothing dodgy going on there. She was pregnant and she was determined to give birth on Yorkshire soil, because Yorkshire was proving the most troublesome part of the kingdom. And so she thought, if I give birth to a child on Yorkshire soil, then the people might kind of think more kindly of us. They might adopt that child, see them really as one of their own. And so, when 8 months pregnant, Matilda embarked on a 200-mile journey north from London up to York. She was aiming for York. Now, travel in those days, when there are not really roads, rudimentary tracks, and she would have been travelling in a sort of wagon train, incredibly dangerous and uncomfortable journey for her to undertake. But she almost made it. She made it to Selby Abbey that you see there, which was 14 miles sort of south of York. And there she gave birth to her last child, a son, Henry, the future Henry I. And just as Matilda had intended, the English people really took to Henry as they didn't to any of the other Normans, because they saw him, he's homegrown. He was born on Yorkshire soil, he must be okay. So it was actually, for Matilda, worth the effort. And during the years that followed, she really focused on enhancing the image of the Norman dynasty. So she concocted this ceremony known as a crown wearing, where she and William would literally appear clad in their finest gowns and with glittering coronets on their heads. And crown wearings became a key part of royal tradition. And she would always go to town with all the ceremony, the pomp that William had no patience for. This was a man who held court on a carpet in the middle of a forest because he couldn't be bothered to go to the nearest castle. So he was completely different to Matilda, but she realised that it's what the people wanted and expected from their monarch.